Welcome back to The Heat. There's been a lot of skepticism about President Obama's strategy and the escalation of U.S. military force in Iraq and Syria. Several key Arab nations have offered military help, but Egypt is unlikely to send troops, and Turkey says it will not allow the United States to use its air bases. Joining us now is Manal Omar. She's the acting vice president at the Center for the Middle East and Africa with the United States Institute of Peace. Also with us in the studio, Stephen Miles, Advocacy Director for the Win Without War Coalition. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Manal, another war declared, and this could be a coalition of the willing. It looks like it's a coalition of the unwilling right now. But do you see a clear strategy here that is being articulated by the United States and its allies on what they want to do, how they're going to end this, how they're going to get out of this?
I think that the hope is that by having an international community, hopefully working with regional players on the ground at the forefront, that a declaration of war on the Islamic State will first and foremost allow for that no longer them to have any room for expansion, to be able to contain and hopefully to eventually eliminate. The concern, of course, is if the strategy is only military, then our fear is that it will be a failure because it really needs a political solution to deal with the issues on the ground.
Right, Stephen, we have been here before, haven't we?
Yeah,
declaring these kinds of wars. The United States, as Manal points out, seems to think that the exclusive use of force is going to change this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Manal's absolutely right to talk about kind of, not only have we been here before, quite literally in this space, but we've been here before in terms of having a conflict and a problem that we all say only has a political solution, and then throwing the U.S. military at it. That's a recipe for failure. You know, the recent polling is actually really interesting. It was 62% of Americans support the airstrikes. 68% of Americans think they won't work. Now, that's a real juxtaposition there. And if people don't think they should work, well, they're right. And if they're not going to work at solving the problem, then we shouldn't be doing them. We should be looking at solving the actual problems, because that's the only way you're really going to change the game.
Right, Manal, when we listen to Barack Obama, or for instance, the British Prime Minister David Cameron, they use terms like destroy, decimate, degrade IS. Can IS be defeated? Because are you just fighting a group of people here, or are you fighting an ideology? That's
a really good question. It's a primary emphasis that we keep saying is that you're fighting an ideology. And, ISIS is one of the most brutal, cruel, extremist groups that we have seen, but it is a mutation of other groups. And the moment that you defeat ISIS, my fear without a real political solution is that a new mutation will emerge and we're back to where we started. This cycle has been happening for over a decade, and I hope that we learn the lesson that we really have to get to the root causes of the conflict to be able to defeat the ideology. And that's the question. Why is ISIS successful? Why does it have land? Why does it actually have income generation? And how do we stop people from adopting this ideology by countering it through other means?
Stephen, I'm wondering to what extent the United States and its allies here are really honest in their intentions, because the two incidents that seem to have triggered off this declaration of war were the beheading of 2 American journalists, and then we also very tragically had the beheading of a British aid worker. Yet there are other countries in the region, Turkey for one, Egypt for another, that are treating journalists in a very brutal way as well. We don't see any action being taken against them.
Well, I think that the American policymakers are genuine in their desire to want to do something, and they're echoing a kind of sentiment we're hearing from the American public. When you see this type of brutality, and when it was happening to Americans, it exposed Americans to a way that they hadn't viewed what the brutality that's been going on for years. For Iraqis, for Syrians, this is not new brutality. This didn't start with the executions of James Foley or Stephen Sotloff. Unfortunately, this type of horrific violence has been going on for years. And so there's an understandable desire to want to do something about it. And I think that is genuine. But picking up on what Manal just said, we have to be smart about this. The examples of Yemen and Pakistan and Somalia were kind of held up. There's more militants every day in Yemen and Somalia. You can't bomb your way out of these problems. When you just do these at-distance airstrikes, you end up with a situation like Waziristan, where there's rising extremism, where it's destabilizing all of Pakistan. We've seen this movie before. We know how it ends. And it doesn't end with peace and stability. It ends with more conflict and more extremists.
In fact, talking about the end, how does something like this end? I mean, at what point does the United States say, okay, we've prevailed, we won the war, mission accomplished, all done, let's go home?
Well, we've said all those almost literally on different phases in the last 10 years. And I think because we haven't really been able to address, again, the roots of the conflict, what's actually triggering it, and working with leaders in each of the countries, but particularly in the region. I think that's the challenge, is that we created a vacuum in, several vacuums across the region, and someone else has filled them. In this case, it's been extremists who have filled them. I think the true end to this would be to find legitimate voices, really work with them in trying to find a way of developing a new social contract with the community. Because whether we want to admit it or not, that's what ISIS is doing, is they're developing a very harsh, enforced social contract with the community because of the vacuum. But if we can provide an alternative structure of power, I'm confident that would be the true end. I think we have to resist the argument that it needs to be a benevolent dictator or strong man to provide that stability, but take the heavy lifting and the long way to developing someone who has true legitimacy and can really control the population.
All right, Stephen, looking at the alternatives, I mean, you've been very critical of the declaration of war by the United States. You've actually said that Congress should actually start asking some really tough questions about why the United States is entering this war, what does it hope to achieve, etc. But what are the alternatives?
Well, so there's lots of alternatives. I mean, when we talk about a group like ISIS and we kind of, what separates them from the myriad of other extremists and ultra kind of violent groups you see in the region, there's a couple things that separates them. One of them is their access to financial resources. They have incredible financial resources. That allows them to pay more than any other organization for fighters in terms of their salaries. It also allows them to gain more resources in terms of arms and other things. When you look at this conflict and you look at something like their ability to sell oil on the black market to Turkish smugglers and others, that is providing them with financial resources that no amount of American bombs will degrade. Unless you cut off that funding, unless you go at the source of their strength, you can do all the bombing you want, it's not going to solve the problem. So it'd be better to do alternatives like that because you'd actually cause more damage to the group. And you'd create the possibility that you could get to the type of political solutions that Manal just pointed out, you really need to get to.
You know, Manal, that's very interesting because one of the ways that the United States was able to degrade Al-Qaeda's ability to carry out attacks, more attacks, was to cut off the financial pipeline. You know, they squeezed it. There was no money going. But here we have an organization that is rich in its own right.
That's right. And I think part of it, we're not doing, I still think that there's a lot more we could do to cut off the funding for ISIS. We have allies that have either direct or indirect links, and we need to really put a lot more pressure politically on those allies to cut off the funding, but also the reality of ISIS having gained land. I mean, if you remember the days of Al-Qaeda, they were fighting from remote areas. They didn't have access. There actually is the formation of a state. Now, I wouldn't call it an Islamic state and take a lot of objection to the use of the word Islamic state, but there is a state. I mean, the first sermon by Baghdadi was not calling for fighters. It was calling for lawyers. It was calling for doctors. It was calling for engineers. And so you see that formation, and add to an income generation, I think it does pose a real threat that we haven't seen before. In addition to the cutting funding, I would say also really attacking and cutting the rhetoric that they're using. The more media says terms like so-called Islamic State, the more media really questions any link with Islam, then you're taking away a rhetorical argument, which is part of the recruitment ground. Keep in mind, Islamic State is decentralized, and so they're targeting independent militias to join as fighters. And if we're able to go to the ground and target those militias with another way of accessing power and change, I'm confident that they would actually choose something more in the medium ground versus going to such an extremist group.
So they're actually a grouping of disparate groups.
That is correct. And you're already seeing between Baghdadi and between some of the Syrian fighters a huge disconnect that I think we should be taking advantage of, and again, providing other forms. But it goes back to your original question. We need to fight the ideology. So at the same time, we need to be very careful who we make short-term agreements with, because that may be the long-term new mutation that I talked about earlier.
Right, and Stephen, speaking of rhetoric, is the problem being magnified here in the United States? Is it being made out to be a far bigger threat than it really is? I mean, we had an official, a security official in the United States who was saying that ISIS is not planning an attack on America, is not operating in America. But we don't hear that message. You know, the message we're hearing is that America's directly in the face of this threat.
Well, we're certainly hearing a lot of political rhetoric, and we should remember, first and foremost, when we're hearing that, we should remember what those people have said before. And it's kind of interesting to hear some of the folks, the John McCains, the Lindsey Grahams, others who have been so wrong about this region for so long. People like Dick Cheney, who talked about mushroom clouds over America when weapons of mass destruction exist. We have to take a step back and remember that this rhetoric, it's prevalent on TV, it's out in the media constantly, but just because they're saying it doesn't make it right. You're absolutely right. The American security officials have said there's not any imminent threats that they know of. That's not to say this isn't a dangerous group. That's not to say there's not real concerns about foreign fighters and other things. But when you have kind of exaggeration and you have the kind of fear-mongering that we've seen by some of the folks in this country, it creates problems where you're going after policy solutions that aren't going to get at the concerns. So if the concern is foreign fighters, there's a way to do that. And hopefully, we hear talk that the U.S. is going to do that through the United Nations later this month. There's ways we can rationally do that without sending the country all back to war. We have to have an honest conversation. We have to take a step back. We have to debate not only what the threat is, but what's the best way to counter that threat.
Right, you say honest conversation. Manal, I mean, is the United States having an honest conversation here? Because when it talks about a comprehensive solution to what is happening in this area, politics seems to get in the way. It says now Iran can't be a part of this. No, Syria can't be a part of this.
Mm-hmm. I think that, I mean, one thing I would say is I agree with what Stephen was saying in terms of in the past we've been misled. I think that we have talked about this threat to such an extent where it's actually manifested in reality. I've worked 20 years in the region in Middle East and Africa, and I have to say that ISIS is one of the first times where I can't sleep at night. It's a very different level of threat than we've seen before. And I think part of the fear I have is not dealing with Iran, you know, being a little bit naive in terms of thinking that we can solve ISIS in Iraq alone and not necessarily take on Syria. I think that that is a conversation that is still ongoing. I think it is a conversation that policymakers are struggling with. But deep down, I'd be very surprised if there's any expert either in the region or who has an understanding of what ISIS is in terms of countering violent extremism that could say that it could be done without Iran in particular, but also without addressing the situation in Syria. And again, not necessarily just militarily, but really talking about a political solution for Syria. Many people from the region would argue that you have ISIS because of the neglect of following up on the crisis in Syria.
Right, Stephen, we've heard this term very often when the United States announces that it's declaring war against someone, and that term is mission creep. At this stage, the red line the United States says it will not cross is the use of ground forces in this war. Do you believe that?
Well, no, I don't believe it. I mean, it depends on how you define ground forces. There's 1,500 Americans on the ground. Many of them are now embedded in kind of operational units. There's reports coming out about clandestine forces, you know, that are already there. So we know about the 1,500. There may be more in the CIA, JSOC, and elsewhere. This is a perfect, classic example of mission creep. You know, we have to remember back the early part of August, what was being talked about? The kind of march towards Erbil and the Yazidis on the mountain. Both of those are gone, right? Yet now we're talking about not only continuing operations, but we're talking about expanding operations. We're talking about getting involved in the middle of a civil war that a year ago we roundly rejected getting involved in. And so this is kind of the definition of mission creep. In fact, some people have said it's mission leap. You know, we now have seen, again, 1,500 troops. We don't know where that'll end. I believe the president's sincere in his efforts to not want to get re-involved in terms of a large-scale footprint of ground troops, but this president's not always going to be the president. And when you start bombing, when you start doing this, the famous adage, you know, the enemy gets a say as well, right? You don't always have control over what comes next. What are we going to do if the airstrikes don't dislodge them? What are we going to do when they retreat back into population centers like Mosul and Raqqa? How are we going to go after this if all we're offering is airstrikes in limited capacity? What then becomes our next step? Again, we haven't had these conversations. We haven't asked these questions.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us, Manal Omar, Stephen Miles. Thank you.
That's right.